Hello, everyone. This is another Meet the Researcher event in the framework of the ATHENA's and Monnet chair. The aim of the chair is to focus on the multiple crises that have led to the increased attention of the EU's role as a global actor. And some of the questions we're trying to tackle with teaching, research, and activities in this chair is to see how the EU can become a more relevant global actor, if it can become a more relevant global actor, and how it can contribute to peace and security. Um, my name is Dimitris Bouris, and I'm the chair holder, but I also want to acknowledge the work done by my colleague, Dr. Olga Burliuk, who is a senior researcher in the chair. This is the Meet the Researcher series. And the idea of this series is for our students in the class, but also for the people who will be watching this video eventually, to have the opportunity to get insights from well-established colleagues who are researching these different aspects related to the EU's role as a global actor, how they conduct their own research, what kind of cases or case studies they use, but also what questions guide their own research and what motives also guide their own research. And what we hope to achieve with these events is to inspire our own students to think and reflect on their own positionality as well as on their own research methods. And I'm super happy to have with us today Dr. Somdeep Sen, who joined Roskilde University back in 2018, and he has been an associate professor in international development studies at Roskilde since 2020. Before joining Roskilde, he was a PhD student and later a postdoc at the Department of Political Science at the University of Copenhagen. Som's research focuses on race and racism in international relations, liberation movements, spatial politics, settler colonialism, and post-colonial studies. He has been a very prolific academic and author, and I cannot make justice to your whole CV and list of publications, but I do want to mention your book, Decolonizing Palestine, Hamas Between the Anti-Colonial and the Post-Colonial, published by Cornell University Press in 2020. And you have also co-editing The Globalizing Collateral Language from 9/11 to Endless War with University of Georgia Press. Your work has appeared in several outlets, academic and media outlets, such as the Washington Post, Al Jazeera, Foreign Policy, the Huffington Post, Open Democracy, the London Review of Books, and a lot of other outlets as well. You're a very busy person, and we are very thankful that you could make time to be with us this afternoon. And I'll go through different publications of yours. But I would like to open this by taking you back to your PhD years and ask you what led you to decide to pursue a PhD in the first place. What was your PhD about? And also what made you research this particular topic, and what kind of methods you used for your research?
All right, thank you, Dimitris, and it's really nice to talk to all of you. I'm currently in Arusha on part of my sabbatical. I have usually I end up doing like 30 public talks a year, but in the next 4 months, this is the only talk I'm going to do. And obviously, just the framework of what you're doing here is incredibly important. Also to understand, an undergraduate professor of mine had told me when I was an undergrad that, always think about why the researcher is writing what they're writing, right? So I think it's incredibly important, the questions that you're asking. I mean, for me, if I have to talk about my PhD, it in many ways goes back to the beginning of my sort of post-school academic career. I should add that I started my undergraduate education in upstate New York in 2003. This is upstate New York is all Trump country now, but it is also the most, it's the poorest county this side of the Mississippi. It is also one of the least racially integrated places in America, right? So I started my undergraduate education in 2003, so the year of the US invasion of Iraq, mid of the US war on terror. So, and I had told I'm originally from India, so I told the US visa officer that I'm going to study physics and economics. Except when you arrive in upstate New York in the midst of the US war on terror, you realize that there are bigger issues at play that, I knew nothing about or I wasn't prepared to really think about. So suddenly I was in the midst of this, political, whirlwind where you have intersecting questions of race, of colonialism, of settler colonialism. I'm sure you're also, read a lot of Dimitrius's work on EU and Europe and Middle East relations, so Orientalism. There's this terrorism discourse. So I and very quickly switched to the social sciences, and I saw my academic journey to be this learning thing. I started by, doing what, I thought would get me a job and a green card and American citizenship. But then it just became this sort of learning process. And if I think about my PhD, that's what it was. It was that a continuation of my learning process. And a learning process that began back in 2003, where I was wondering how these intersecting structures and politics of colonialism and race and settler colonialism, that if you look at the history of a field like international relations, it had the very foundation of it, right? How that shapes not just academic literature, but also what we know about the world. A colleague of mine asked her students, how do we know what we know, right? And is there a different way of, approaching what is often seen as taken for granted, perceptions of the world, good, bad, war on terror, war on drugs. Like these are these sorts of phrases that have become so ubiquitous with, politics today. What if we reframe it, and what if we, and that's what led to my present research as well, right? I mean, my 2020 book is about Hamas, and my focus was, what if we take Hamas out of that framework of an Islamist terror organization, and what if we place it in a pantheon of global liberation movements where violence was very much part of it, right? Of state building processes that came in the era of the post-colonial state. What happens to our understanding, not just Hamas, but also of a place like Palestine? So that meant, of course, as you know, a lot of the mainstream things have changed in the discipline, the mainstream disciplines, and at least political science, these questions were completely, marginalized. So it meant, of course, finding different theoretical perspectives, looking at different disciplines, but looking at thinkers that weren't thought of thinkers. Someone like Frantz Fanon, whose work plays a very important role in my book, wasn't something you deal with in a political science department. And of course, you can imagine I'm in Copenhagen looking the way I do, and then I'm reading Frantz Fanon and Hamas and Palestine. So the story, writes itself, a story that's also playing out today. But it also meant methodologically, I had to critically think about where do we find knowledge about them. And I think this is extremely important, even as graduate students, right? What the data you choose, the methods you choose will shape your understanding of the subject at hand. So if I want to study Hamas and I choose to only look at their religious texts or whatever, that will shape my understanding. But then when I did field work, in Gaza for my PhD, it meant that it was an extremely different understanding of the political realities, and that has since then pushed me to very much focus on the sort of qualitative bottom up methodological approaches.
Thank you. I do want to go to 2015 and your article in Middle East Critique, which was entitled Bringing Back the Palestinian State, Hamas Between Governance and Resistance. Could you please talk to us a little bit more about this article? Was it part of your PhD? What was it about? And what was the focus of the article?
So the article was focused on, essentially what I wanted to look at is how do you have these structures of, state building that have been put in place. We know that they don't work, yet they exist. Much of it is funded by the European Union, as you know well. So what if we focus on this thing that doesn't exist, yet is ritually there? How does that shape politics around lives around people? So in many ways, this article was very much a rehearsal to my PhD and then a rehearsal towards, my book, where I wanted to take, the state building perspective, look beyond whether a state exists or not exists, but look at how these structures, when they're put in place, what kind of rituals happens and how that shapes political subjectivities. So, this is another sort of been my focus, or something I've tried to do in my work is a lot of times, and I remember this from my undergraduate and graduate days, pushed to say something completely new, discover something, right? And that often assumes that we know what we know and there's nothing more to say about it, right? I think it's an equally important approach to the social scientific endeavor, where we try to find new ways of looking at something that we know, right? What happens if I introduce this theoretical perspective? What happens if I start comparing, say, as in my work, Palestine to, say, South Africa or India or Kashmir? How does that shape our understanding of Palestine? This is not to trivialize the specificities of these places, but it is to, take tools and knowledges from other places and see how that can give us a new understanding of what we know. And again, this goes back to that critical perspective of how do we know what we know? And can that be challenged? And why do we know what we know, right?
I do want to ask you a little bit more specifically about the field work which you mentioned in Gaza, because you are a researcher who has used ethnography and ethnographic methods a lot for his research. And I would like to ask you, how difficult was it to do this kind of field work?
I mean, the difficulty was twofold, right? One is the difficulty or the challenges one faces from within the academy. Every discipline, and this is again good for all of you to know, whether you stay at the graduate level or you want to do a PhD, that every discipline has its own norms and rituals, right? If you say in an anthropology department, you want to do field work, no one will bat an eye. People will say, how long, right? If you want to do field work in a political science department, one of the first things I was told that we don't do field work in political science. And we do even less field work, amongst people that we, let's say, don't like, right? You're not allowed to go to a war zone, is what I was told. As Scandinavian bureaucracies work, I called the insurance company, and they said that this was the phrasing: a war zone is not covered, is what they told me. So so that was one of the first challenges, where I was told that if you want to be a good political scientist, you shouldn't tread that path, and you shouldn't take on a theoretical methodological approach that normally political scientists don't do. So that was my big challenge, right? The disciplinary challenge. And this is something, Dimitris, you would know as someone who is an academic. Being a PhD, you're in a very vulnerable stage. You want to be accepted. You want to have a job in a sector that is, shrinking by the day. The fight for resources. So you want to do everything you want to do to fit in, right? So that was one big challenge. I think the second one, of course, was at the actual practical challenge of getting there. I chose to go to Gaza um, through through Egypt, which meant getting approval from the Egyptian authorities. Um, they gave me a 3-day pass to enter Gaza. You can leave whenever you want, but then that 3-day pass to enter, the first day was the day you are in Copenhagen, so you couldn't, travel that day. Day two is when you travel, so you essentially had a day to enter, right? So that already creates a lot of insecurity. But what was, of course, entering, it took about, a few hours to get through from the Egyptian side to the Palestinian side. But it also meant that, sitting there, one of the things that, you know, um, you do, especially in political science and IR, is the tyranny of the theoretical perspective, right? In the sense that the first day when I started my PhD, someone asked me, what theoretical perspective are you using? And I was like, I don't know, I haven't collected data, right? And there is this push to, be driven by your theoretical perspectives and your theoretical world, a theoretical contribution. And then the context just sort of disappears in the background, right? But when you go into a place like Gaza, where you see this, there's the overwhelming pressure of the context. You have these huge militarized borders. You have people under siege. People are getting foodstuffs and basic necessities through the tunnels. The absurdity of an open sea, but you can't travel. The absurdity of, the Palestinian border control official asking you, so did you come in by the border or the tunnel? As if like, did you come by train or plane, right? So there's so much in that context that then pushes you to throw out that theoretical perspective, throw out that question, and then rephrase what are the most important challenges you should study. And that's one of the things that I write in the methods chapter of my PhD, is that we should start writing, especially with ethnographic perspective, it's important to start writing down what are the experiences in the field that provoke our emotions the most. Oftentimes, these are seen as culture shock, but oftentimes they also point to the most important or challenging or noteworthy puzzle that demands social scientific inquiry. So, yeah.
I do want to stay within this topic because in 2019 you published a co-authored monograph with Michel Patze entitled "The Palestinian Authority in the West Bank: The Theatrics of Woeful Statecraft." So I would like to ask you if you can tell us a little bit more about this book, what kind of conceptual approaches you used, because you raised this as well, but also what kind of methods you used for this research.
So conceptually, it was once again, what happens if we study the state in a place where the state doesn't exist, right? That's something that initially pushed me in my PhD as well. But I knew that, of course, there was a limited framework of Hamas, Gaza that I had to cover. I was also talking about settler colonialism, which meant that I spent an extensive amount of time in places like Tel Aviv and Jerusalem to understand the settler colonial context and how that operates, to then embed Gaza and Hamas in that, right? But then I knew that there was this other politics that was also happening, which is not, disconnected from that settler colonial context, but something through working with Professor Pash, but also Dimitris, we have also interacted several times on this sort of issue of EU Middle East relations, but also the role of Palestine, where you have this massive amount of resources being put into this institution that literally doesn't exist. Yet so much resources and political capital is going into keeping up the performance. How do we study that performance, right? Again, from the top down, we can say, oh, this is working, or this is not working. We can say there is no state. But when you go into the field. And that's what we did. When you start doing an ethnographic approach, a bottom-up approach, you start interviewing, people who've been beaten up in Palestinian Authority prisons. You start talking to, government officials. You start talking to police officers. You realize that while this state thing doesn't formally exist in that way that we would like it to, yet it still shapes the lives and subjectivities of a whole bunch of people, right? A whole generation of people who believe that, at one point we were fighting for liberation and we were wearing fatigues, and now we're wearing a suit, and there's a dignity to it, and there is a whole life to it, right? So again, here ethnographic approach was very, very important. Also to really look at these buildings, these, institutions, these prisons. These aren't just, brick and mortar things. They shape the lives of people around it and inside it, right? So ethnography, again, asking and engaging in these long sort of storytelling was very much part of that book.
I'm going a little bit back and forth, but the year before that, in 2018, you also wrote and published on the refugee crisis and the Syrian refugee children. Again, what led you to this kind of research? Like, still, I mean, if you want to call it the region, but researching another aspect, which.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, I mean, the edited books the book that you edited, Dimitris, or co-edited on EU Middle East relations, right? One of the things that this sort of work also triggers is that we're not just talking about a place over there. That, a place over there is very much shaped by our self-perception, right? That's all Orientalism is about, right? It's not an accurate depiction of the Orient. It's a reflection of how we view ourselves vis-a-vis the Orient, right? So I think that, 2018, we're in the mid of the so-called refugee crisis. I live in Denmark, and I don't know if y'all have heard or know a little bit about Denmark had an extremely, let's call it, repressive response to the refugee crisis, which devolved at some point towards, taking jewelry away from Syrian refugees to pay for their stay. If you've been to Copenhagen, if you've been to Denmark, it's not exactly a poor place, right? We pay high taxes in a welfare state specifically to help those in need, right? It's not, so it's part of that collective agreement, but somehow, that was put aside. So it became very important to take some of those perspectives that I have developed in terms of how the non-West is viewed, the racialized view of the other, and combine that with, the lived experience of this very racialized, racially hierarchical society or European society. So it became part of that. It became part of that agenda. It was an edited book, so my chapter, I believe, was about politics, activism, and academia. And I think I wrote about barefoot academia or something like that, where we we place our ethics and morals and politics in center stage and combine it with our theoretical and methodological choices. But the way we brought in contributors, it was about bringing in the perspectives of the silence, of the marginalized, and also approaching it from a place of equality, right? In the sense that, a lot of these questions, what can Denmark learn from Jordan? What can Denmark learn from Beirut? Which, places where there are hundreds and thousands of refugees, right? While Denmark is complaining about taking a few thousand. So what I was saying is that it was important for us to come from a place of equality where we learn from each other, and we had contributors from the region, but also from Europe, where we talked about in a very open way about what could a place like Denmark that only has a few thousand refugees, what could they learn from the municipalities in Lebanon or Jordan who are dealing with hundreds of thousands of refugees, right? And that sort of knowledge always flows from north to the south, right? What if we flip that? So
And I
yeah.
do want to stay within this because in 2020, 2021, you started writing more explicitly on issues related to race, racism as well. I have your security dialogue article of 2021, which was entitled Coloring Critical Security Studies, a View from the Classroom. Which is one. I mean, I'm a big fan of your work in general, but this is one of my favorite articles, if I can say that I have some favorites. Could you tell us a little bit more about what led you to start writing on these issues more explicitly? They have always been part of your research, but there is this 2020, 2021 where you start writing more explicitly on these.
I mean, Dimitris, you know the timeline of academic publishing. So, I mean, I started writing it in 2018. It only came out in 2020. But it also meant, it was because that 2018 is when I left the political science department at Copenhagen to move to Roskilde. I believe it was that year or the year before I had very explicitly written a blog post about racism in Danish academia, and basically just made a list of things I've experienced. Right, that became sort of, I was always very. It was in the background, as you know, but again, I'll be honest, I'll be sort of open about it. I'm a brown guy studying about Palestine, settler colonialism, Fanon. Um, that was already too much in a political science department where I was the first foreign PhD they had hired ever. So they've had, I was the darkest person for the longest time as well. So, I was constantly made to feel, inferior. I was called a lazy N-word, and, and all of this went into that blog post that came out in Disorder of Things. So, these things had been building up in my head, right? And then, in 2020 or something, I think there was the controversy with the security studies group at the University of Copenhagen. I don't know if everyone knows about this, but Dimitris, you can sort of. Well, basically, what happened? You had an article that came out in Security Dialogue, basically accusing the Ola Wavers and Lena Hansens and Barry Buzans of the world of taking point of departure in critical security studies and sort of racialized understandings of the world, which which created this sort of weird bit pandemic, weekend academic controversy, which bigger scope of things is but in our world it was huge, right? And people were split. These two women who had written about it, queer women who were facing huge backlashes. The right wing in Denmark had been mobilized. And, I also felt that, the scholars at the University of Copenhagen, and specifically the political science department, were being a bit sort of bashful about their sort of position and positionality, and somehow had been blind to the 6 years of racism that I had encountered, or, at their department. So essentially, when that came about, I, jumped straight in and wrote that article. I saw there was a special issue at Security Dialogue where I thought that, let's talk about the academy. Let's talk about what we, educate our students with, what kind of texts we hand to them, and how that shapes their intellectuality and future generations, right? So it was, again, a very personal thing that had been gnawing at me. But again, if you go back to my PhD, I was told these questions aren't valuable in the mainstream discipline. So I was very surprised that when I wrote that blog post for, Disorder of Things, it was a national conversation in Denmark, quite literally. My phone died because Twitter was going crazy. I was called in from the biggest sort of news channel, news show in Denmark, because they had discovered that there's racism in Denmark, you know? And it was a wild experience for me. And of course, I didn't want to, if you read that sort of blog post, you'll see it's a list. Someone said this to me, someone said this about my heritage, someone called me this. It's just a list. So there's nothing there's nothing to, really discuss. It's your problem, you deal with it, right? But it was revealing to me that it was very, somehow people were surprised. People were calling me from my old department who had witnessed me experience some of these things, apologizing and then trying to buy me coffee. And I was like, well, make it white wine and we can talk. Uh, and then, all of that was, jokes aside. But then what I was really touched by was inner city schools in Denmark. The kids were, ethnically mixed schools were passing around, that piece, and people were talking about it, right? And that was a real something sort of clicked in my head to be a little more forthcoming with some of these conversations where, you're always looking at the white male senior straight scholar and for their approval, right? And someone who looks like me, you're like, how am I falling short all the time? But then you realize there's a whole generation of young people who are also interested in these conversations, right? Who do feel marginalized in a variety of ways. And if I have a platform, I have a commitment to talk about these issues.
And yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I appreciate your input a lot. And I'm really sorry. I'm not surprised. I'm sorry about what you've experienced and how you experienced it as well. But this also brings in another element of the researcher, which is that a lot of times we do start writing or doing some kind of research from a very painful place. So it's not necessarily that we start doing this because we enjoy something, but maybe in a lot of cases, we do it because we're in pain. And that's one of the ways where we can alleviate the pain. And
Yeah.
that's equally important, I think. You continued on these topics and you also co-edited a special issue in the Review of International Studies on decolonizing to reimagine international relations. Can you tell us a little bit more about this special issue?
Yeah. So I think that around that time, with that controversy with critical security studies, people started taking sides, but questions of race and racism and colonialism and post-colonialism in IR, somehow found center stage. It also has to do with people like, say, Robbie Shilliam, these Mira Sabaratnam, these, scholars of color at very high stages in their career, bringing these discussions into the forefront, being who they are, but sort of, unapologetically talking about these questions. So that meant that when you start seeing the Subratnams or the Shilliams do these things, it sort of, again, I started noticing a very sort of ritual way of talking about, critical, intersectional, post-colonial, and people were just throwing in these words without it having any material impact on how we do research and how we teach. And again, from, if you look at my introduction, I think it's in my introduction where I talk, again, I come from a very personal perspective where I gave a book talk at my university where everyone was very supportive of the critical, race, this and that. And then, in private, they said, well, practically, how can decolonization really happen? So on the one hand, they were securing their moral high ground by saying that, hey, I support, decolonization, right? Yet they're also securing their future by saying that it's such a, colonialism is so ubiquitous to whatever we do, undoing it would be so difficult that it's an impractical thing. So we don't really need to get into any structural change, right? I thought that was very frustrating, right? And so, this special issue where we bring in scholars, from Tanzania, Qatar, the Caribbean, we sort of bring in this perspective and ask, if we were to say tomorrow we decolonize, right? And we take different points of departure from within the discipline, what would that look like in very practical, concrete terms? What happens if we put the question of race, colonialism center stage? What happens to the discipline? What happens to the theoretical perspectives we use, the conceptual perspectives we use? Actually, that special issue, has triggered to another project that I'm working with a colleague, Reese McHolt, who is in Glasgow, which is a textbook called Revisioning International Relations, where if you look at the table of contents, it's all the things you would expect in a international relations 101 textbook, realism, constructivism, and all of that, except our point of departure is questions of race and colonialism. And we put that in the center stage and see how the mainstream operates. That's the first half of the chapter. And the second half of the chapter is, if we were to revision this and look at it differently, what would it look like, right? So I think, it's another thing where I think it's important also as scholars to not just be critical, but to understand the politics and the sociology of the mainstream and how the mainstream became mainstream. What are the structures, institutions, curriculums, funding bodies, how they all contribute to making the mainstream, right?
That's super interesting. I'm really looking forward. Is there a publication date to this? I know I should have asked.
Yeah. So we signed the contract a year ago with Georgetown, and then we're hoping that all the contributions come in by this summer. So hopefully, again, academic publishing, right? Yes. So we're hoping that next year we can have something more concrete. But we have 18 contributors from as far as Medellin in Colombia to Seoul, South Korea. So I'm excited about this.
Wow, yes, sounds really exciting and very much needed, actually. We have a little bit of time. I do have two more questions, but I also want to leave space to students to ask their questions to you. A very brief question, but I know it's not that brief. Another work of yours, which I'm a very big fan of, is your book and the monograph on decolonizing Palestine, Hamas, between the anti-colonial and the post-colonial. And I know we touched upon this a little bit, but I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about this book.
I mean, this book, again, an extension of my PhD, where I, in the introduction, I think I say very clearly, I'm not going to talk about Islam or Islamism. I'm going to find new colonial, post-colonial perspectives to understand an organization like Hamas, but also, how it operates and how we understand it. So it's about Hamas, but it's about, broadly about liberation, right? What does it mean to be liberated? What are the trajectories that a liberation struggle takes? We often have a very economic understanding of liberation, in the sense that, did you do this? You did this, right? And did this lead to liberation? No, it didn't. So then it was worthless, right? But if you look at, say 200 years of, 300 years of Indian colonialism of India under British rule, liberation movements take a lot of twists and turns, right? And it's so I came in from that perspective. It's books take on different lives as well. So the book came out in 2020, where it was it was seen as an interesting perspective on an organization that a lot of people have written about, right? And sort of this eclectic brown guy talking about Fanon. Okay, interesting, right? And it was supported by a lot of people, but then, October 7th, 2023, the book was a different thing altogether, right? And it became, for some, it was, a book that one needs to read to understand how an organization like Hamas operates, because a lot of the experts that you see don't know anything about it, have never been to the region, right? And for others, it was like, an excuse for, or, me making excuses for October 7th, anti-Semitism, and, all of that, right? And it's not like I haven't faced that before. In 2021 or 2022, my book talk in Glasgow was cancelled because a student organization said that I was planning to deliver an anti-Semitic talk. They didn't have an abstract of my talk; they just had the title. But all it said was decolonizing Palestine, and that was enough. So it's been an interesting journey with the book because, again, with the book, I've traveled to Medellin, I've traveled to South Africa, and then I've traveled to Vienna, right? In Vienna, the university president had I'm at Central European University, which some of you may know the university. I'm an alumni of that university. And the university president called the police on me, right? So the police came to the campus right before. And then, you take that book and you go to South Africa, and people are like, yeah, we understand that settler colonialism thing. We know a little bit about it. Let's talk about the next. So, so the book is about liberation, but turns out it's about a lot more. It's about race. It's about, how we relate to that part of the world. It's also about, again, the politics of what we know about, right? And, how me giving even a sliver of opening, because again, my book is very deeply, ethnographic with long stories, is seen as problematic. And Dimitris, the politics of this as well, right?
Yes, and as a last question, I do want to touch upon this because it's important. Maybe you and me know it, but not everyone knows it. But it's important for people to know that all these efforts to silence people, to cancel people, etc., did not just start on October 2023, but they go way back. And people like you and like me and a lot of others have faced all these much before October 2023. And this is my last question, because you have written a lot on academic repression of Palestine solidarity. You also touched upon your talks being cancelled in 2022 and 2021. And I just want to ask for your broader take on where do you think we stand politically, because one of the things you also raised was that at some point there was an opening up of the space for people to come with more critical research, more critical approaches. And it seems to me, at least, that this space is, is becoming smaller and smaller again. What is your take of where we stand
I
politically,
mean,
but also how this affects us as academics and how it affects academia?
I mean, it's fairly clear at this point that this space is shrinking faster than we can catch up, right? I mean, um, I think that opening that I mentioned, that opening existed, or that opening was there because we were talking about politics of the past, because we were talking about massacres that happened in the past, genocide that happened in the past, and that doesn't have the kind of teeth that talking about Palestine has. You don't see, there are very few critical scholars have reached the highest echelons of academia talking about Palestine. So, we're talking about a long history of silent repression, and now, whatever happened on October 7th and the narrative and discourses around it have meant that that's been an excuse to go after, a lot of us who, take that sort of critical perspective, and that's been taken that, and it's seen as, okay, this person talks about race, that ends up here, with regards to Palestine and so forth. So I mean, it's a very disturbing time where only a few years ago, I had faced death threats on my parents are in the next, okay, I'd faced death threats, and a lot of threats on my work email. And, I've had Indian authorities, because I also write about Hindu nationalism. So I've had Indian authorities show up to my parents' place in India to check on me for a few things that I've written. So, a lot. And before October 7th, I feel like, the university still had some sort of duty of care. That's not there anymore, right? I've been pulled up for just delivering a book talk. So we're facing a very, very difficult time. And, I think Ilan Pape was talking about this as well, right? He sees, we're in the end stages of the political project in Israel, right? And of course, oftentimes it's in the end stages that things are the most repressive. And, that's going to happen through people like you and me, Dimitris, but let's hope that it leads to a better future for our younger colleagues, right?
Hopefully, I'm not very optimistic, but let's keep the hope alive.
Yeah.
I do want to open up. We have 10 minutes because some really needs to go in 10 minutes. Are there any questions?
Maybe in 2003, he was working on, what was it again? That was your studies in upstate New York.
Physics and economics, yes.
Okay. I was asking myself, how do you, in 2003, of course, with the invasion and of course post 9/11, how do you, cope with all these changing circumstances and focus your research? But if you were doing economics, it's maybe a different topic.
Well, that was another thing, that economics and physics, and especially economics, wasn't addressing what I was experiencing around me, right? We're watching this TV news. It was extremely skewed. It was all about this war jingoism. And being the person the way I look meant that I was, implicated in that, right? I was faced every time I traveled out to the US. It was almost a joke that I was, facing, additional, checking or whatever, right? And I felt that, I'm not saying that all economists are like that. I mean, the recent Nobel Prize in economics was given to economists who work with colonialism and the economic effects of it. But at least the way I was taught or was being taught in upstate New York wasn't really affecting, wasn't really addressing these issues. I had taken an elective on student protests in the 60s. It was one of these courses that you can take or you have to take as a bachelor student in the US, where the content doesn't matter, but it's about teaching you how to be a university student. So you learn how to use the library. You're 18, right? So you're learning how to use the library, how to write a paper, so on and so forth. But then so for a lot of people, it was skill building, but for me, it was the content, right? Where, I had a different perspective on politics that I then started, I mean, at that time, our best source of critical news was Jon Stewart. Jon Stewart has come back now, but at that time, that was his peak. So to get a critical media perspective, we were going to Jon Stewart, and to understand race and racism in America, it was Dave Chappelle and Chappelle Show at the time. And they were both on Comedy Central. That should tell you how ridiculous the world we were living in at the time.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yeah.
So now that Trump has cut all the financial and military support for Ukraine, do you think the Israeli government might be next up?
Oh, no. No. I mean, I just don't think that, the American right ideologically, politically is very much intertwined with the Israeli state, not just the Israeli right. So I think ideologically they're too intertwined. And for you, I assume you're critical student of Demetrius, which is why you're watching the news and going, well, this is hypocritical. Surely this is going to, channel into you to Israel, but I don't think so at all. So, I mean, at least in the last few interactions between Trump and Netanyahu, nothing gives me the sense that that's what's on the way. So, yeah.
Yeah.
So on the advice of Demetrius, I read your book last week, which was amazing to read in the first place. But I was wondering, because I read all like your interviews with these high officials, Hamas, Hani, and everyone, and I was just wondering how it was to interact with them. Just.
I mean, it wasn't any different from, interviews I've done with Israeli settlers. I mean, I know that there's a certain portrayal of them, but then, oftentimes they're in their physicality and in the way they approached me, they often, let's say, they talked in very sort of bureaucratic and diplomatic terms. Albeit they're talking about mukawama resistance, yet they're wearing a suit, which is often, kind of, I had to buy a suit in Gaza. It's not in the book, but I had to buy a suit in Gaza because I was told I wasn't dressed nice enough to meet the Hamas official. And, in my mind, I'm like, you're fighting the resistance. What do you care about a suit? But I had to go suit shopping in Gaza, which is a weird experience. So it wasn't, again, ethnography is beautiful in that sense, right? We have these perceptions of these people, and I'm not making a qualitative assessment of whether they're good people or not good people, but they were educated, aware, politicians essentially, right? Who knew what they were talking about and were able to interact in a very at a human level, right?
Thank you. We have time for one last question. I'm looking at, yeah.
Maybe, so first of all, thank you for all the information. That was very interesting. And I was wondering what advice you really have for aspiring young people who want to somehow enter this shrinking space. Because that's a scary future in a way, right?
Don't do it, man.
The $1 billion question.
I mean, we are zoo animals. We don't have any other skills, right? No, but I think that the only advice I can give you is be very true to your perspective, your positionality, and your interests. The discipline is weird in that way, where the structures and the norms and the rituals are such, it'll push you to write in a way that you're not comfortable with, take perspectives that you're not comfortable with. The work that's going to come out of that is not going to be authentic. It's definitely not going to be interesting, and it's not going to take you anywhere, right? So the best thing you can do is to be truthful to what you find the most interesting. Find a supervisor that can help you. A PhD supervisor, in that sense, can make or break in supporting you. Try to also find a network of like-minded academics. If you can't find them in your department, travel to big conference, go to different panels, and you'll see that you can build your own little community who help you, who teach you, who help your work be better. But I think that being honest and truthful in your work is incredibly important. And it's very difficult. I think that rarely is there interesting work that's out there that isn't coming from this personal place of truth, right? So, but if you get a better, well-paid job, do that. Yeah.
Thank you. We'll close on this kind of positive note, and I would like to say a big thank you for your time being with us. It's been a pleasure and an honor having you in our class, and also for the people who will be watching this video eventually. And also thank you for spending time during your precious sabbatical to do this, which is something which we appreciate even more, and keep up all the great work, not only the academic one, but also the personal one. And I hope that our paths will cross soon, maybe not in Tanzania, but maybe in Europe or somewhere else. But
Yeah.
thanks a lot once again for being with us.
Thank you and good luck, everyone. Yeah.